So I'm Debbie. I'm the president of the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society and sponsors with Downtown Cottage Grove for the History Pub. And I want to thank Bart for letting us have the History Pub in this wonderful venue. We're in a historic building. All of you here probably have heard my spiel before about that this was built in, and I took it out. So 1908? Yeah. I do have it on here. So anyway, you're in a historic building in our beautiful historic downtown Cottage Grove. And I want to recognize the partners in history. And we have a loose group in Cottage Grove of all the historic organizations. And we have the Cottage Grove Historical Museum. Yeah, Cottage Grove Genealogical Society, Oregon Aviation Historical Society, the Cottage Grove Historical Society, Bohemian Mining Museum, and Singing Creek. Yes. I just want to make one announcement that the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society has been given a gift by the Woodard Family Foundation, and we now have Ancestry.com Library Edition in our library, as well as Newspapers.com Oregon Collection. And so those are available for patrons to come into our library and use. That is awesome. And for those who weren't here recently, thanks to the Woodard Family Foundation, they gave us a grant, the Partners in History, a grant for digitizing the local newspapers. And we just found out that the money that they donated will do like 14,000 pages, and it will get us to February 28th, 1957. Okay, that's 27 years worth of the Sentinel being digitized that you can search in the convenience of your own home. So if anybody wants to learn how to use any of these databases, I'm more than happy to help. So tonight from the Oregon Aviation Historical Society, I would like to welcome Mark Baxter. And Mark is a retired firefighter paramedic from Corvallis. He owns and flies a 1941 Taylorcraft vintage airplane. He sits on the board of the Oregon Aviation Historical Society and enjoys helping out around the museum wherever he can. His other interests include fly fishing and building model planes. Thank you for coming tonight, and I look forward to your presentation.
Well, on behalf of the Oregon Aviation Historical Society, thank you so much. Again, I'm Mark Baxter. I sit on the board of directors. And Annette Whittington is here. She's on the board of directors, and her husband Dennis is here, restoration specialist. Tonight, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the museum and a little bit about Oregon aviation history. Oregon's aviation history is so colorful that tonight what we're going to get to do is hear a few stories and just touch a little bit on some interesting history. Each of these stories we could do 2-hour presentations on, but this will be enough to wet your whistle, I hope. We're going to start with a video about the Beaverton Outlaws. Now, who's heard the term Beaverton Outlaws? There's a few people. Okay, I'll set the stage a little bit. Who remembers what year the Wright brothers flew? Anyone? 1903. So the time period that we're going to talk about is the 20s and 30s, sometimes called the golden age of aviation. And if you think about it, that is just a few years after the Wright brothers flew the first time. And at that time, there were lots of people in this country who had never seen an airplane. especially in rural areas. If you lived in a city or a big town, you would see airplanes. But even into the 30s, the early 30s, in rural parts of the country, there are people who'd never seen a plane fly. And I think if you look up rural living in the dictionary, in the 20s, Oregon was right there. It couldn't get more rural. So it was really not long after the birth of flight that there were folks here in Oregon who got a taste for flying and they wanted more. And they didn't have money. It wouldn't be long after they started flying that the Depression hit. And the folks that could fly nice airplanes were actors, oilmen, people that had money. Most of the people in Oregon didn't have those means, but they really wanted to fly. And so they figured out how to do it on their own. And they didn't have money, but what they had was a will to do it. No one told them they couldn't do it. And so they went about figuring it out on their own. Sometimes with plans they got out of a magazine, sometimes plans that they drew out on the barn floor. These folks were farmers, machinists, welders, sawyers. They figured out how to make it happen with very little means. And so this first video is an overview of the Beaverton Outlaws, so called because in 1921 the state of Oregon saw fit to form the Board of Aeronautics, first state in the country to do it. And this was years before the feds even got involved, years before there was an FAA. And so people were building their own planes, and the state of Oregon was saying, yeah, do it. As long as they're safe, you should do that, and we'll help you do it. And so there was a little airport outside of Beaverton called Bernard's Field. And a farmer named Charlie Bernard became he hitched a ride into Portland to see one of the first airplanes fly in Oregon, flew off the roof of the Multnomah Hotel. And Silas Christopherson. And Charlie Bernard was absolutely smitten. And so he decided to take some of his uncle's farmland and put it in a runway. And these folks started flying there. And they were doing whatever they could. They were, like some of the folks actually would jack up a Model A and put a saw on one of the wheels and use that to saw lumber for wing spars. I mean, they would do whatever they could. They were using motorcycle engines, car engines. In one case, Les Long, the sage of Cornelius, actually designed an engine and built it in Western Oregon. A little 2-cylinder engine called the Long Harlequin, made all of 25 horses. But they were doing it, and they were pretty successful. So let's watch this first video.
Right after the First World War, 1920, is when the State Board of Aeronautics established state laws, way ahead of the federal government. We didn't even know if the federal government was going to take over control of airplanes.
The Oregon Board of Aeronautics, which is one of the oldest boards in the country, they had a licensing provision which included an aluminum license plate. We had licenses. I even had an Oregon State student permit. And then later on, I got an Oregon State private license.
1926, the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Air Commerce, came into being. There were complete standards for the certification of aircraft, pilot training, and set up for the various types of licenses, and then all the rules and regulations for the transport industry and instrument flight.
June of 1926 is when the government took over the regulations. And that was before the FAA and before the CAA. It come under the Department of Commerce Aeronautics branch. The state of Oregon was the outlaw state of the whole United States. Connecticut and Oregon were the two outlaw states that didn't care what the federal regulations said or what they wanted us to do. We kept on flying anyhow.
Around about 1938, why it changed from the Bureau of Air Commerce to the Civil Aeronautics Administration. More extensive documentation, more regulations, more inspection for repairs. They had a lot more people that came into being.
The boys at the airport, as you've heard, were not licensed by the federal. They were only licensed state. And this was quite a battle. Many letters, many hours of meeting with people trying to keep the state license. In fact, one time, Fred had a plane that was stolen. He went out to fly, and the plane wasn't there. Someone picked it up and took it back into the hills. And to get the state people to help you was fine, but the feds, because we were not federally licensed, didn't want any part of it. We did get the plane back. We found out where it went, and why the fellow took it, we never knew, just a lark.
They were more or less always harassing us and trying to cause us trouble, and they wanted to inspect the airplanes, and they wanted to do this and they wanted to do that. They knew we had the state's rights, but they didn't want to respect them, and so consequently they'd say, well, every time you take off it's going to be a fine, something, I don't know, $1,000 or something. They had a fantastic figure all drove up, and they said, you're going to, every time you'll land and every time you'll take off and us. And I told him, well, I said, you get your book because you're going to fill it up. We're going to just keep on flying. They were writing all our names down, and it was going to really put us in jail, I guess, or something. But it didn't pan out for them because the state was still backing us up. And any time that we seemed to want to go to an air meet, they seemed to always be poking around and wanting to cause trouble and harassment. And just like one of them came up to the hangar one day and he wanted to look at my airplane, and it would happen to be a little bit muddy out there by the hangar. He says, go get me a board and lay down so I won't have to walk in this mud. And I of course told him what I had in mind then too. I didn't call him a federal inspector either. But I wasn't about to lay my coat down like Sir Walter Riley for that guy.
Yeah, 39 and 40. And that's when Charlie Walker was really hassling people through any means that he could. Why he attempted to stop that type of flying that was out there, but there wasn't really much that he could do legally.
On a couple of fly-ins down to Springfield, Oregon, Charlie Walker was down there and he said, if you guys fly up the airways, I'll cite you and fine you. Yeah, in fact, I think he got physically abused a couple of times too. I think there were some real good fist fights.
The guys would get a gang together and they'd go down to the beach for a weekend. I've washed a lot of sand out of some of those old biplanes. You know, they'd camp out on the beach for a weekend and really have a roaring party. Or if they wanted to liven things up, they'd go up the coast, up to Longview, and have a big blast there. Well, Longview is Washington, which put the feds on their backs. You know, the feds would start coming around, and they'd start looking, you know. And I remember well an incident involving a flight under a bridge up near Longview. And there was a loop involved. And the bridge keeper was madder than hell, but he couldn't identify the aircraft for sure. But anyway, the feds hunted Beaverton for a week trying to figure out which biplane it was. Mm-hmm. You doing any flying this week? Oh yeah, I fly every day. Why? And just nosed around. They finally gave up, you know.
The CAA started to foster a program of requiring federal licenses on airplanes, and this went against the grain of the guys who were at Beaverton, and in fact it kind of generated the atmosphere of an outlaw group because of it. This started probably 1939, 1940, and even in 41, and right up to the war. I was flying on the Sunday of Pearl Harbor, and I remember landing and coming in, and someone said that they had bombed Pearl Harbor. So, and I didn't fly anymore that day, and the reason I recall this is because the following week, all airplanes within 100 miles of the coast were grounded.
It was George that challenged the federal government to arrest him for flying an illegal and experimental aircraft. And he was the first man to bring about the new flying rules by the federal government that permitted us once again to design and build our own airplane. If it hadn't been for George Bogartis, the present home building movement would never have been at all possible. It was because of his foresight and because of his grit and his determination and his nerve that we do have the present laws that permit sport aviation.
He took off and he headed east, and he made a personal appearance in Congress, and he petitioned Congress to have the ban on home building removed. He presented his aircraft as proof that this was possible for a man of average means and average intelligence to put together a sound, safe aircraft that was capable of long-distance flight and a safe flight. He demonstrated the aircraft, he took Congress to see it, and he won the battle. After he got done with Congress, he continued east. He flew the GB around the Statue of Liberty and then turned her home.
In the video, they talk about the Beaverton Outlaws, and it's really interesting that because the Oregon Department of Aeronautics was formed so early in the game, the state of Oregon wasn't differentiating between factory-built airplanes and home-built airplanes. They would come out and inspect your airplane and register it. And they didn't really care whether it was built in a factory or you built it yourself. If it was airworthy, they would register it. Well, that really set the stage. As things developed and the FAA got involved, they came up with all these, as you can imagine, regulations about certifying aircraft. But Oregon was still certifying airplanes on their own out here. And this set up this dynamic that was the folks here against the feds kind of a deal. That's how the Beaverton Outlaws came to be called the Beaverton Outlaws. As time went on, it kind of looked like it was going to come to a head because they said, you know what, you can't stop us. We're going to keep flying. The state of Oregon says we can fly. And the Fed said, no, you can't because your airplanes aren't certified by us. And it was going to end up in court, and what happened was World War II. Everything stopped, and then after the war, so much had changed that Oregon, like every other state, conformed to the federal regulations. But because all this had happened, the groundwork was laid for home building. And how many people know about the Experimental Aircraft Association, the EAA? Right now in the United States, you can buy a set of plans, you can build your own airplane, and thanks to the work of the EAA, someone will come out and inspect it and you can fly it. That's not true in a lot of countries around the world. And those rules would never have happened if it wasn't for the work that was done by the Oregon pioneers that were building their own planes. So really, everyone in this country that builds an airplane today and flies it has Oregon aviators to thank for that. Let's see, I want to touch on a couple things you saw in the video because it might come up later this evening. Did you notice Bernard's Field, where you saw a lot of those pictures were taken? And it would be fun to go back and look at each picture and talk about every airplane in the picture, but about half of those airplanes were factory built and half were built by folks right there on the field. They were home-built planes. And that was Charlie Bernard that made that place for those folks to be able to come and fly. And he built hangars for everyone that wanted a hangar. And it was all, he built the hangars out of used lumber, he used signboards, he used recycled metal, whatever he could do. And hangar rent was like $2 a month. But it was just a really wonderful place for amateur aviation at the time. So you can remember the name Charlie Bernard and Bernard's Field. Did you notice the license plates? So a lot of those airplanes had license plates on them, just like if you had the license plate for your car. Oregon was the only state that did that. And they started issuing license plates in 1921, and they went right up to the beginning of World War II. Did you notice the airplane called the Student Prince? There were several pictures of the Student Prince. Well, the Student Prince is notable because it's Oregon's only certified airplane. It was designed and built right in Portland. There were 6 that were built. The Depression, unfortunately, like a lot of small airplane companies, the Depression did them in. But they were very successful airplanes. And there are 3 that exist today. But the Student Prince was Oregon's only certified airplane. Does anyone have any questions? All right, I'd like to talk a little bit about the museum. The Oregon Aviation Historical Society is home to a museum right here in Cottage Grove at the airport. How many people have been to the museum? Ah, yes! Yes! That's a pretty good number. I want to say that the Northwest is really blessed with the number and quality of aviation museums that we have. In Seattle, there's the Boeing Museum of Flight, which is a world-class museum. In McMinnville, there's the Evergreen Museum, where you can go see the spruce goose. Up in Hood River, there's a world-class museum called WAM, the Western Antique Aircraft and Automobile Museum. But right here, tucked away in Cottage Grove, at the little airport, Jim Wright Field, is the Oregon Aviation Historical Society. And what we have going for us is we're the only place that's laser focused on Oregon aviation history. So when you come to the museum, everything you see is Oregon. Oregon planes, Oregon pilots. And our mission is to preserve Oregon's rich aviation heritage. So we're a 501c3, which means we're a nonprofit. We have one part-time employee, Rachel, who couldn't be here tonight. Volunteers, donations, grants, sales. There's a picture of one of our heritage home builds in front of the museum. So when you come to the museum, there's several things that you'll get to see. We have the biggest collection of aircraft license plates at the museum. The aircraft that's the yellow and black one that you see, that's a less long Longster. There's a lot of Oregon airplanes and planes that are under restoration. The other thing that's at the museum is the archives. Oh, let's go back. We have an extensive collection of Oregon aviation archives. And people come from all over the place to study in our archives for magazine articles, books, presentations like this. And it's in a, it's a true archives. It's a temperature, humidity controlled environment. And we have some really wonderful history there. Here's Wimpy. We'll talk more about Wimpy in a little bit. This is probably our prize heritage home built. This is the Great Lakes biplane, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. This is a one-of-a-kind Great Lakes aerobatic biplane that was flown by Dorothy Hester and then by Tex Rankin. At the museum, we're always restoring aircraft. One thing that's interesting about the museum is that, like you saw in the video, there's a lot of home builds that were built in Oregon throughout the 20s, 30s, and then later on after World War II as well. Most of those airplanes were one of a kind. And what's so interesting is that one by one over the years, we've tracked down a huge number of these airplanes and saved them. And to me, it's nothing short of remarkable. Most of these airplanes should have been, they should have been balled up in a pile behind a hangar somewhere and gone to dust. But they really ended up in the most crazy places, usually just an archaeological dig, I mean a bag of bones. But we've tracked them down, we've got them and brought them home, and we're restoring them one by one. And so there's a lot of restoration that happens there at the field. Here's some of our heritage home builds, the Irely Wiffle Hen, the Rupert Special. Walt Rupert flew this little Rupert Special plane that he, of course, designed and built. He flew it to a world altitude record right here in Western Oregon. And then again, Wimpy. So also the museum hosts fly-ins and events every summer. You've been to some, I guess. They're a lot of fun. There's the Jim Wright Stearman fly-in, which has been going on now every summer for 44 years. 45? 44 years? Then in June, there's Wings and Wheels, which is always a lot of fun. Lots of airplanes, antique cars, motorcycles, hot rods. And in September, we host the great Oregon Home Built Fly-In. Oops. We're going to see another video. So this next video is going to talk about two of our heritage home builds, both of which we have at the museum.
Well, can you tell me about the first airplane that Les designed and built?
This particular airplane had a welded steel fuselage structure, but being cautious about whether or not it was a flyable machine, he didn't want to put any more time in and work into it than he had to before he had some proof that it was a flying machine. He had it test flown without any covering on the fuselage. Just the wings were covered. And we had a fellow who was a commercial pilot who flew some of the airline planes into Portland come out and test fly it. It was a hot day, and with all this extra drag on the fuselage, I presume, prevented it from actually getting off the ground far enough to clear the fence at the end of the field, and he flew it into a telephone pole and wrecked it. Fortunately, he wasn't hurt. So that was the end of that plane. That was a total loss. The next plane that we built was built in a similar way, but we made the mistake there of trying to cut corners again, and instead of welding the steel tubing, he brazed the tubing with brazing brass with little gussets. This had a one-piece elevator, and the rudder was above the elevator, so that the elevator had complete freedom for up and down motion. And that particular plane really flew quite well. And it turns out that I was the one that test hopped that myself, although we didn't intend that. I took it out to taxi it one morning, and it was a little bit gusty. I taxied it back and forth a few times, and finally I found myself in the air, and we flew it around a circle and came back, and that was the test hop for that airplane. I think I'd had all of 10 hours of flying experience by that time.
The Longster will always remain, to me anyway, as a pretty decent sort of design that was fairly stable, and it was strong. The Longster was light, terribly light. She weighed under 400 pounds. But her strength lay in the wire bracing, and it would handle a small field. Battle for engines was really exemplified in Long's creative talents. He tackled building an engine. He built quite a credible engine that could turn out around 30 horsepower using the cylinders from a Harley-Davidson. That was the Harlequin. It was a twin.
He got interested in building an airplane propeller for the little 40-horse Piper J2 airplane. We made a few of those things, and they turned out real good, so we started making them out of birch and putting the metal tips on them. And we got the FAA, the old CAA approval on that prop, and it's still listed in their specifications even today.
There was a company by the name of Piper was starting up in the east about that time, and Long was building the propellers for Piper. And they wanted him to build under contract all the props for him, and he said they didn't want to, so some guy by the name of Senchonich decided he could do it. And I remember that when it all happened. They wanted the Longster prop was a good prop, and they wanted him to build him all the props he could build. Well, he could have sold to Piper, but he didn't want to get complicated. He didn't want to complicate his life. In fact, I skipped my last year of school to build the Ralston low-wing. He was building a low-wing wire brace. He didn't want to name it after Long because he thought his reputation was in the high wings.
And Les, he was one of the first people to make a low-wing airplane, concept of a low-wing airplane that would recover from a spin successfully, which in the old days they always felt that a low-wing airplane was a very dangerous airplane, and it turns out that if you made the tail moment long enough and got the rudder back far enough behind the wing where it wouldn't be blanked out during the spin, that's why it has such a long fuselage, and it was a very stable, very excellent airplane. Les Long contributed a tremendous amount of knowledge to the airplane industry in his own quiet way.
And that was a real forgiving, safe little airplane. Its fuel tank was a 5-gallon can, converted and soldered up for a fuel tank. And it had a 26 horse Runke engine in it, true cylinder Runke engine, flathead engine. And it had, originally it had air wheels on it, but the tires were getting hard to get for those 16/7 air wheels, so I don't know who, there at Beaverton, put a couple of wheelbar wheels on it, and they worked out real good. They were a little harder riding, but they worked real good. And it did a lot of flying. A lot of fellas flew that. It was a nice flying airplane.
The AAA Flyer, a magazine published by the Amateur Aircraft Association, took note of the Holmes brothers in a 1944 issue. In part, this is what was written by George Bogardus. Some of the most enthusiastic and outstanding home builders of aircraft are boys from the farming districts. Perhaps this is because of the inherent ingenuity and common sense with which our farmers are so naturally gifted. Several years ago, we heard of two boys and the glider they were building. Their story is one of the true amateur, the builder who relies not on books, theories, and enticing advertisements in magazines, but on their own creative instinct. From somewhere, they had obtained a manual with the drawings and dimensions of a Northrop primary glider. Other than this, they had no help. They had neither ridden in nor seen an airplane close up. They knew nothing of engineering data that could be obtained, nor of supply houses that carried equipment for aircraft. This glider airplane is now a thing of the past, except for an engine, some fabric, and a propeller. But it seems to us that if there were ever a Hall of Fame for home-built aircraft, this ship should be among the main exhibits.
How old were you when you started building the glider?
Oh, I was about 18. And, we had no table saw or nothing. The kids today, they've got it made. So we got an arbor of some kind and made a wooden wheel, put a saw blade on that. And we jack up the old folks' Model T, the hind wheel, and shove that up against the hind wheel of the Model T. That's why we ripped all those sticks out. A lot of the work was done at night with a Aladdin lamp, a kerosene, lamp. Well, they gave off pretty good light. And we were doping the wings in there. And then as it went on, we later thought we put a motor in it. So I'd go over and bother Les Long a while. He was kind of, didn't know whether to let us have it or not. He wanted a written permission from our folks. And I don't remember now, it was Jim Lyons or some kid fixed up something, and so we went over and we bought it, the case and the crankshaft, Then we picked up the cylinders and so on. We got an old truck mag, great big heavy old truck mag and stuck on there. And a 4-cylinder, then we short two of them out. So just a 2-cylinder. No, we got the crankshaft with it, yeah. We broke it later. And we got Minkin's boys at Hillsboro. They bought us a chunk of metal. And we got a hold of an old lathe. And we turned out a new one. We bored holes and hacksawed down, took out chunks. Just started in that way. Then for the ends coming out, cut down, cut over. Well, we had time, what the heck.
Did you have any instruments?
Out of a magazine paper, pasted on. That was it.
I mean, you had pictures of instruments on
Yeah.
it?
Uh-huh.
You didn't have a tachometer?
Yes, that was a speedometer. We got an old speedometer stuck in there for one. Yeah. So we knew about what the motor was turning.
So we have both of those aircraft at the museum, and Wimpy, I'll just say a couple things about Wimpy. Well, first of all, Wimpy was owned and flown by Myron Buswell, who was a Beaverton outlaw, and a real war hero. He flew during World War II. And then he had a long career in aviation here in Oregon, retired at Independence. And his daughter is Annette, and she's here tonight. But Wimpy is a very important airplane in the sense that it was Les Long's most successful design. And you saw in the video about George Bogardus flying to Washington, D.C. to petition for rules for home builders. Well, the plane that he was flying was a follow-on to Wimpy. And later, there would be airplanes that were built by Tom Story in Portland that were a follow-on to that design. And after that, there was a famous, very ubiquitous home built called Flybaby, that there were thousands built, and they were all based on Wimpy. But anyway, let's watch a video about what Wimpy looks like now. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the other airplane that was mentioned in the last video, the Holmes glider. This picture up here is the twins when they built the plane, and you wouldn't imagine that it was true that a couple of twins got a magazine and decided they wanted to fly and started building a plane in their barn. But that's exactly what happened. At some point, they were doing it at night, and at some point Dad found out and said, no, you're going to kill yourselves. So they moved the project to the neighbor's barn, and they kept building. And like the video said, they actually flew the plane successfully for a year or two, and Charlie Bernard out at Bernard's Field actually pulled that glider off a hill with his horse. He would rope a bungee to the horn on his saddle and pull the boys off a hill with his horse. Later, they wanted it to be a power airplane, and it was never designed to have an engine. It was designed to be a glider. So, but they decided they were going to forge ahead, and they went out to Les Long's place in Cornelius and said, we want to put an engine on our glider. No, can't let you do that. You're going to kill yourselves. They persisted. And I talked to Don Holmes' son, Jerry, and he told me the story is absolutely true. Les told him no a bunch of times. And finally, he said, all right, you get a permission slip from your parents. I'll help you put an engine on it. So they went down the road to one of the neighbors and got their friends to write a letter and sign it. And Les said, okay, I'll help you. And they did. They put a Les Long Harlequin engine on their airplane, and they flew it successfully. And they talked about the instrument panel. Well, if I didn't see it to believe it, I never would have believed it. But there's the instrument panel right there. And they didn't have money for instruments, so they had an old Nicholas Beasley catalog, and they cut pictures out and they shellacked them to their instrument panel. And they flew it. As a matter of fact, the plane flew well enough that one day Don Holmes was flying around Beaverton, and he got caught over an overcast. And he actually flew around over an overcast. He couldn't see the ground at all. I mean, this is a pretty rickety little airplane. Until he found a hole in the clouds and flew down through the hole and made his way back to Beaverton. Eventually, the plane fell into disrepair, and Dale and Don decided that their families weren't happy about the plane at all. And so they made the boys to agree to take half the plane to where Dale lived and half the plane to where Don lived, so that never the parts would meet again. And in time, a lot of the parts did go away, but Don saved as much as he could of the plane, and when he was older, his son Jerry helped him start rebuilding it. And then Don passed away, and just it's one of those barn find stories. I happened to be at the museum one day, and a gentleman came in and looked through the museum, and he said, you know, that picture on the wall's familiar, and that looks like a picture that's on a wall of a auto body shop up in Forest Grove. I said, nah. He said, yeah, I think that's the same airplane. So I started cold calling body shops until I found one that, sure enough, they said, yeah, his nephew, Don's nephew, owns this body shop. So I talked to him, and he said, yeah, that plane exists. It's in a barn in Bend. And he gave me the phone number of Don's son, Jerry, and we went to visit him, and he agreed to donate it to the museum. And it's almost done being restored. And is Mark here still? So I want to introduce Mark Chulowinski because he's one of the famous Chulowinski brothers, Coburg, Oregon. Is he smiling? I hope. Mark is a tireless volunteer at the museum. He and Dennis have both worked on Wimpy for hours and hours, and Mark has put a lot of work into restoring the Holmes glider. So if you come to the museum at some point, you'll certainly get to see Wimpy, and it won't be too much longer, you'll get to see the Holmes airplane too. So how can you help if you're interested? We have memberships, and I brought brochures and applications so you can become a member. They start at $25 a year. We can always use donations. We're in the process of trying to put together enough money to build a new museum building. We have way too many cool airplanes and not enough space to show them. But I'll tell you what we could use a lot of, and that's people that are interested in Oregon aviation history. So please, 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 if you're interested, come out to the museum and talk to us about volunteering. And so with that, I'll take any questions that you might have. I don't know of any in terms of the Golden Age era. There weren't that many planes flying around. And you know, it's interesting that you bring that up because for all of the innovation and you know, work that had to go into designing and building a plane from scratch, it's amazing what a good safety record the Oregon home builders had. There were a few accidents, and in the years leading up to World War II, there were a couple of fatalities. But for all the flying that was going on, they had a remarkable safety record, really. Well, you're referring to when home building was getting started again after World War II. Yeah, it's an interesting time period for sure. So much happened with aviation technology during the war years. I mean, it just accelerated exponentially. And so when the war was over and general aviation was getting geared up again, things had changed dramatically. There were thousands and thousands of rules and regulations that never existed before the war. And of course, planes that they thought were good airplanes before World War II were pushed off into the dustbin of history. What made it difficult for home builders is that when all the regulations changed, there were no provisions for home-built airplanes. And so kind of as a brief example, if you wanted to get an airplane certified to fly, you had to provide the CAA with 2 complete examples that they would destroy in testing, destructive testing. Well, it's not possible for a home builder. I mean, the engineering and all the work that would go into it, so there were no rules. So again, the Oregon home builders came into play. They were ready to go again. They wanted to fly their planes again. One of the folks, George Bogardus, who was mentioned in the first video, he and Les Long and a bunch of other people, Ace Corbin, Heath, Pete and Pohl, there were a lot of people who were trying to get the home building movement going again. They decided they would organize and petition to Congress for rules for home builds. And really, Bogardus, you can't say enough about what he did. He took his little GB, which was based on Wimpy, and he took off from Beaverton and he flew to Washington, D.C. Quite a flight in a little airplane like that. Did it not once, not twice, but 3 times. And he was successful by 1950, I think 54. They finally passed a body of regulations for home building. And really, for those of us that are, I'm building a home built right now, we have George Bogardus to thank. Well, actually, no. By then, things had kind of changed a little bit, and he had a more sophisticated welded tank to make the trip. He did, however, have one thing that's interesting is to make the cross-country flight, he had a small tank that he built, put in behind his seat, and he had to wobble pump fuel from that tank to the header tank because he didn't have a fuel pump. And so he literally wobble pumped fuel from one tank to the next to feed the engine. Oh, that's a really good, I'm so glad you brought that up. It's, I should have mentioned it. So Charlie and his wife kept the airport going until 1969. And it's interesting, Charlie never became a pilot, but he loved airplanes and he loved pilots. And he did everything he could to keep it going, but the airport was getting swallowed up by Beaverton. And he tells the story of when he could remember when the annual taxes for the airport were $100. When he finally was forced to give up the airport, the annual taxes were $42,000 a year. And Charlie was a farmer, and he just couldn't do it. So where the airport was is now the Cedar Hills Crossing Mall, Beaverton Mall. I don't know if anybody knows. Walker Road, Cedar Hills, okay? That's where the airport was, yeah. And Charlie tells a story in another one of our videos that he said, how did he put it? Have you ever wanted to cry but you just couldn't? It killed him to give up the airport, but he said, you know what? They offered him in the beginning $2,500 a month, to rent that dirt to build the mall on. And he said to he and his wife, $2,500 a month was, they didn't have to worry again for the rest of their lives. That's a good question, but I know a lot of the airspeed indicators didn't register past 100 miles an hour. So they weren't flying very fast. Some of the airplanes didn't even have an airspeed indicator gauge like we think of today. What they had was a thing out on the wing strut that had a little paddle, and it had a spring behind it. And the faster you went, the more it pushed that paddle. And they had hand-painted numbers on a thing on the wing strut for 50, 60, 70 miles an hour. And that was their airspeed indicator. Whatever worked, right? So that's a really good question. And there is a website and Facebook page. Yeah. Well, thanks everybody. I sure appreciate you coming. I got to say, I'm in my happy place because we were talking about airplanes and we're in a tavern. So